He didn't think of himself as lonely. That word felt indulgent, almost dramatic, and his life had no room for unnecessary language. He thought of himself as occupied, rooted, required. The ranch needed him every morning before the sun had fully made up its mind to rise, and it needed him long after the sky had gone dark again. Animals didn't care about grief. Fences didn't repair themselves because a man was tired.
We have to
Land,
go now!
especially land that had been
Don't
held
look
onto
back!
through loss
Run!
and stubbornness, demanded presence, full presence. And so that was what he gave it. Years had a way of passing without ceremony out there. Seasons rolled over each other like quiet waves. One winter bled into the next summer. Calves were born. Storms came through. Repairs were made. Repairs were undone again. Life kept happening whether anyone watched it closely or not. And he learned how to move inside that rhythm without asking too much of it. He learned that if you keep your hands busy and your expectations modest, time doesn't hurt quite as sharply. He hadn't always planned for this life to be so narrow. Once, a long time ago, there had been a different version of the future. One with voices in the house at night. One with someone else remembering things for him. One where the end of the day meant sharing silence rather than simply collapsing into it. But plans, he learned, are fragile things. They don't survive everything. Some don't survive much at all. Loss rearranged him quietly. It didn't break him in a way that demanded repair. It simply taught him what not to expect anymore. He stopped imagining more than what was directly in front of him. The next chore, the next bill, the next fence line that needed attention. Hope, he decided, was a luxury for people whose lives weren't already spoken for. For people who could afford to believe that something might arrive without demanding payment. He had responsibilities. He had land that had been trusted to him. And trust, once given, doesn't allow for distraction. So he built a life on routine. Routine is a powerful thing. It steadies you. It gives shape to days that might otherwise stretch too wide. His mornings began the same way every time. Coffee strong enough to bite back. Boots that had long ago molded to his feet. A brief pause on the porch, just long enough to assess the weather, the sky, the feel of the air. Then movement. Always movement. There was comfort in knowing exactly what was expected of him. The ranch didn't ask questions. It didn't care what he felt. It only responded to what he did. And that clarity suited him. People were complicated. Land was honest. He learned how to eat standing up, how to sleep lightly, how to measure time not by calendars but by what needed doing next. He learned to fix things himself because there was no one else to call, and even if there had been, asking would have felt like failure. Independence became not just a skill but a principle, a line he didn't cross. Even the house seemed to understand this unspoken agreement. Rooms stayed quiet. Furniture remained where it was placed. Nothing shifted unexpectedly. The walls didn't echo with memory because he kept them neutral, functional. No photographs on the mantel. No signs of unfinished stories. Just space, clean and controlled, where nothing could surprise him. People sometimes suggested he get help. A hand for the heavier work. Someone to manage the kitchen. He nodded politely when they did. Changed the subject. Help always came with presence. And presence came with expectations. Expectations led to attachment. And attachment, he knew, was where things unraveled. He told himself he was protecting the ranch. That too many people made things complicated. That the land needed consistency, not chaos. That solitude was not absence, but focus. And maybe that was partly true. But there were moments, quiet ones, easily dismissed when the cost of that belief surfaced. Moments late at night when the work was done and the house had nothing left to offer except its silence. Moments when he realized there was no one to tell small things to. Not important things, just small ones. A storm that passed closer than expected. A calf that didn't make it. A good day that ended without witness. Those moments didn't break him. They simply reminded him that endurance and fulfillment are not the same thing. Still, he chose endurance because endurance had kept him alive. Endurance had kept the ranch running. Endurance had kept grief from turning him bitter or reckless. Endurance had given him something solid to stand on when everything else had fallen away. And over time, endurance became identity. He became the man who could handle it, whatever it was. The man people spoke about with respect and a little distance. The man who didn't complain. The man who didn't need much. He let that image settle over him like a coat worn long enough to feel natural. But coats can grow heavy when you never take them off. He rarely left the ranch unless necessity demanded it. Town was efficient, transactional. Supplies in, supplies out. Polite nods, brief exchanges. People asked how he was doing, and he answered the same way every time. Fine. It wasn't a lie. It was just incomplete. Companionship to him felt like a risk he no longer had the appetite for. Not because he didn't understand its value, but because he understood its cost too well. Loving something meant it could be taken. Letting people in meant they could leave. Or worse, be lost. The ranch at least stayed. Weathered, stubborn, imperfect, but still there every morning. Still asking him to show up. Still responding when he did. And so he believed that this was the trade. You give up warmth, and in return, you get stability. You surrender the noise of other lives, and in return, you keep the ground under your feet intact. He didn't think of it as punishment. He thought of it as payment. There were nights when he sat on the porch after dark, the land stretched out before him, vast and quiet. The kind of quiet that presses in on your ears until you almost hear things that aren't there. Crickets whine through grass. The distant shift of animals settling in. He would sit there and let the day drain out of him, telling himself this was enough. That wanting more was how people got hurt. He had seen it happen, not just to himself, but to others. People who reached for something beyond their capacity to hold it. People who bet their lives on promises that didn't last. He had learned his lesson early and thoroughly. So when the idea first occurred to him hiring someone to help around the ranch, it felt less like a decision and more like a concession to practicality. He was getting older. The workload wasn't shrinking. Efficiency mattered. It wasn't about companionship. It wasn't about filling space. It was about keeping things running. He framed it that way deliberately. To himself more than anyone else, a cook would be useful. Meals were becoming an inconvenience rather than sustenance. Eating had turned into something he did because he had to, not because it brought any pleasure. Hiring someone to handle that part of the day would free time, energy. That was all. He posted the notice without much thought. Simple, direct, no invitation for conversation, just a statement of need. Help wanted. That was the language he understood. Need, function, purpose. He didn't imagine who might answer. Didn't picture faces or stories. He assumed whoever came would be temporary, transactional. A job, a paycheck, a clear beginning and end. He had no idea that this small, practical decision, the kind he had made 1,000 times before, was about to press against every assumption he'd built his life on. Because here's the thing about lives shaped by endurance. They work right up until they're asked to hold something human again. And he didn't yet know that the quiet, solitary life he believed was the price of keeping the land intact had also been slowly hollowing him out. That in protecting himself from loss, he had also protected himself from joy. That the strength he took pride in had come with an unspoken cost. At this point in the story, he still believed solitude was the same as self-sufficiency. He still believed that family was something that happened once, and if it didn't last, you learned to live without it. He still believed that survival was enough. He stood there, steady and capable, with dirt under his nails and responsibility in his bones, convinced that this was the full measure of a life well lived. And from where he stood, it made perfect sense. What he didn't know, what none of us ever know when we build our lives around necessity, is that sometimes help doesn't arrive to take something away. Sometimes it arrives to give something back. He expected one person to arrive. Quiet, capable, temporary. Someone who would step into the rhythm he'd already built and not disturb it. That was the picture in his mind when he heard the sound of the truck coming up the drive. Engines were familiar out here. He could usually tell who was coming before they even stopped. But this one sounded different, hesitant, maybe, or careful, in a way that suggested someone unfamiliar with long dirt roads and open land. He stood on the porch, squinting into the afternoon light, already rehearsing the polite distance he would maintain. A brief conversation, clear expectations, a job defined and contained. Then the truck stopped, and out stepped not one person, but many. She came first, smaller than he expected, thinner too, as if life had been asking more of her than it had any right to. She moved with a quiet competence, the kind that comes from having no choice but to keep going. Her eyes scanned the place quickly, not with judgment, not with awe, but with calculation. Where could children wander? What needed watching? What might hurt them? That should have been his first clue. Then the doors opened again, and again. Children spilled out like sound breaking through a closed room. Not wild, not unruly, but alive in a way that felt almost intrusive against the vast, controlled quiet of the ranch. One clutched her hand. Another jumped down too fast and nearly stumbled. A smaller one lagged behind, eyes wide, taking everything in as if the land itself might move. Noise followed them, shoes on gravel, voices overlapping. A question asked before the last one had been answered. He felt something tighten in his chest. This was not what he had planned for. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and in that glance he saw it all laid bare. The calculation, the hesitation, the awareness that she was bringing more than she had advertised, and beneath that, something else. A quiet resolve, the kind that says, I don't have many options, but I will stand here anyway. I saw your notice, she said. Her voice was steady, but it carried weight. Not drama, experience. I cook, she continued, and I work, and my children come with me. She didn't apologize. She didn't over-explain. She stated it like a fact of nature. He didn't answer right away. His mind was already moving ahead, cataloging problems before they fully existed. Children meant unpredictability, noise, mess, risk. They broke things. They asked questions. They needed attention. And attention was something he had carefully removed from his life. He had built this place on control. Children were the opposite of that. He told himself to be practical. The notice hadn't specified children. He had every right to say no, every reason. He imagined the return to quiet the moment they drove away, the dust settling back into place, the ranch exhaling. But she didn't look like someone asking for charity. She looked like someone offering labor in exchange for stability. And that unsettled him. Because need, when it presents itself with dignity, is harder to dismiss. He gestured for them to come up onto the porch, more out of reflex than decision. The children climbed the steps cautiously, eyes darting everywhere. One of them whispered something to her. She nodded without looking down, already tracking all of them at once. He noticed how naturally she did it. Grief had rearranged her too. He could see that. Not in the obvious ways people expect, no tears hovering, no collapse at the edges, but in the way she carried herself, as if the world had taught her, brutally and efficiently, that no one else was going to hold things together for her. Widowhood does that. It compresses you, forces strength to the surface before it feels earned. They talked logistics, room, pay, hours, expectations. She answered clearly, practically, without embellishment. The children stayed close, listening more than speaking. One traced a pattern in the dust with a boot. Another leaned against her. Leg like gravity itself pulled them there. Every instinct in him said this was a mistake. And yet, he didn't tell them to leave. Instead, he heard himself say, "You'll need to understand how things run around here." She met his gaze. "I'm good at learning routines." That landed deeper than she knew. Because routine was the language he spoke best. They stayed. That night, he told himself it was temporary, a trial, just until he figured out what to do. He showed them where they'd sleep, rooms that had not heard children's voices in years. He watched as she unpacked efficiently, turning empty space into something usable within minutes. The children explored cautiously, their energy tempered by unfamiliar surroundings. And then something happened that he hadn't prepared for at all. They laughed. Not loudly, not constantly, but enough. A sudden burst of sound in the kitchen when one of them spilled water. A whispered joke that turned into stifled giggles. The kind of laughter that rises without permission and leaves warmth behind it like an echo. It cut through the ranch like a foreign element. He stood in the doorway unnoticed, feeling something shift beneath his feet. The house didn't reject the sound. It absorbed it. That night, he ate a meal at the table for the first time in longer than he could remember. The food was simple, honest, nourishing in a way that went beyond hunger. The children talked over each other, correcting stories, arguing about details that didn't matter. She mediated without raising her voice, her attention split but never strained. He barely spoke. He didn't know how to fit himself into this noise, but he noticed things. The way the children watched him when they thought he wasn't looking, curious, measuring. The way they seemed to instinctively sense the boundaries he carried and respected them without instruction. The way she glanced at him once, just once, with something like cautious gratitude, not for generosity, but for permission. After dinner, the youngest fell asleep at the table. He almost smiled. Almost. The days that followed unsettled him further. The ranch changed its soundscape. Morning still came early, but now they came with footsteps behind him. Questions about animals, requests to help. Laughter carried on the wind as children chased each other between chores. At first, it irritated him. Noise disrupted his focus. He found himself clenching his jaw more often, retreating into work further from the house. He reminded himself that this was temporary, that adjustment was necessary, but attachment was not. Still, the ranch responded. Meals appeared on time, better than on time, thoughtfully prepared. She learned his preferences without asking, learned the rhythm of his days. The children learned where they were allowed to roam and where they were not. They learned to respect the animals, to close gates, to listen. Chaos, it turned out, could be guided, but it could not be silenced. And slowly, without his permission, the children began to claim him. Not directly, not forcefully. They asked him questions about the land, about the animals, about tools. They followed him at a careful distance, mirroring his movements. One day, one of them handed him a tool without being asked, having watched him reach for it 100 times before. That stopped him cold, because that was familiarity, and familiarity was dangerous. She watched all of this quietly, never pushed, never apologized for the space her family took up. She worked hard, harder than he expected, and when the day ended, she was still there mending clothes, calming nightmares, sitting with grief that surfaced without warning. He saw it then, in fragments, the way her hands paused sometimes just briefly, as if memory had reached up and tugged at her. The way her gaze drifted when the children were safe and occupied. The way she carried loss not as a wound that bled, but as a weight she had learned to balance. Their grief was not the same, but it recognized each other. The children didn't tiptoe around the absence of their father. They spoke of him plainly, asked questions he didn't answer for them. She did, when she could. When she couldn't, she admitted it. That honesty unsettled him too, because he had built his life on omission, on not naming what hurt, on not inviting conversation into places he didn't want to examine. The ranch, once defined by stillness, now breathed differently. There was mess now, dirt tracked in, toys left where tools used to lie, a shoe once abandoned in the hallway for 3 days before anyone claimed it. He noticed every disruption, and he noticed something else. He didn't fix them, not immediately. He let some things stay out of place, and that frightened him more than the noise ever had, because order had been his defense, and defense, once lowered, leaves you exposed. There were evenings when he retreated to the porch, listening to the sounds from inside the house. The children's voices softened by walls, her voice steady, grounding, and he felt something unfamiliar settle in him. Not peace, belonging. He resisted that word, pushed it away. Belonging was dangerous. Belonging meant loss hurt more. But belonging also meant something else, something he had not prepared himself for. It meant that the ranch was no longer just a place he survived. It was becoming a place that held life. And life, once invited in, doesn't ask permission to stay. He had asked for help on the ranch. What arrived was a woman carrying grief and children carrying questions and laughter and need. What arrived was noise and mess and warmth. What arrived was everything he had carefully designed his life to exclude. And yet, day by day, he found that the stillness he once relied on was no longer enough to return to. Because silence, once broken by living voices, reveals itself for what it truly is. Not strength, absence. Somewhere along the way, without a single announcement or decision, the ranch stopped feeling like a place that needed to be endured and started feeling like a place that was being lived in. It didn't happen all at once. There was no moment he could point to and say, that's when everything changed. It was quieter than that, slower, the kind of transformation that only reveals itself when you look back and realize the ground beneath you has shifted while you were busy standing still. It started with meals, not the food itself, though that mattered too. The way she cooked told a story, nothing fancy, nothing wasted. Meals that respected the work of the day. Meals that filled bellies and didn't demand praise. But it was the way the table filled that unsettled him. Chairs pulled out, elbows bumped, plates passed hand to hand. Conversation unfolding not in neat turns, but in overlapping rhythms that didn't wait for permission. At first, he ate quickly, as if speed might protect him, as if finishing first meant he could retreat before something reached him. But the children were persistent in their innocence. One asked him why the horses had different markings. Another asked how old the ranch was. Another wanted to know why the sky looked bigger here than it did where they'd come from. He answered short, factual, safe. But questions have a way of opening doors, even when answers stay brief. She watched him carefully, not with expectation, not with hope, but with awareness. She noticed when he lingered a second longer at the table, when he didn't immediately stand once his plate was empty, when he listened, even without speaking. She never called attention to it. That was her strength. She understood that some things only grow if you don't touch them. Work changed, too. The ranch had always been labor, physical, demanding, honest in the way it never pretended to be anything else. But now there were smaller hands eager to help. Awkward at first, slower, prone to mistakes. He corrected them instinctively, then caught himself softening his tone without intending to. He showed them how to do things properly, how to carry weight without straining, how to approach an animal so it wouldn't spook, how to listen to the land. And in teaching them, he felt something loosen inside his chest, something he hadn't known was still tight. Teaching requires patience. Patience requires presence. Presence was something he had avoided for years. The children learned quickly, not because they were gifted, but because they were paying attention. They wanted his approval in the simple, unguarded way children do, not desperate, not needy, just hopeful. And hope, when it's offered freely, has a way of disarming even the most fortified hearts. They began to mirror him, his habits, his phrases. One of them started standing the way he did when listening, feet planted, hands still. Another took pride in doing a task the right way, repeating his words back to him as if they were law. He pretended not to notice, but he did. She carried her own weight alongside him, never competing, never shrinking. She worked with quiet competence, stepping into gaps without being asked. She didn't demand acknowledgement for it. She didn't perform gratitude. She simply showed up, day after day, doing what needed doing. And when exhaustion hit her, and it did, often she didn't collapse into it. She moved through it, gracefully, determined. He recognized that kind of strength immediately. It was the same strength he had relied on to survive. Their conversations were sparse at first, practical, focused, but silence between them changed quality. It stopped being defensive and became companionable. The kind of silence where words aren't avoided, they're simply unnecessary. Sometimes, they worked side by side without speaking for hours. And yet, understanding flowed easily. A glance, a nod, an adjustment made without explanation. She learned his rhythms as instinctively as he had learned the land. She did not try to replace anything that had been lost. That mattered. The children spoke of their father openly, not constantly, but honestly. His name was not forbidden, his memory not fragile. She allowed grief to exist without letting it dominate. And in doing so, she taught them something rare, that loss does not have to hollow you out completely. He listened from the edges. Grief had taught him the opposite lesson. For him, loss had meant closing doors, narrowing life until nothing unexpected could get through. He had believed that survival required less, not more. But here, in this house, that was slowly filling with noise and routine and shared effort, survival began to look different. Belonging crept in sideways. It showed up in small things. The way one child left a drawing on his workbench without comment. The way another waited for him before starting a task, as if it mattered that he was there. The way she set aside food for him when he worked late, even when he insisted he'd eat later. One evening, a storm rolled in hard and fast, the kind that turns the sky heavy and presses rain into the earth with force. He checked fences late, as he always did. When he came back soaked and tired, the house was warm, lights on, soup simmering. The children rushed him, asking questions all at once. She handed him a towel without saying a word, and in that moment, standing there, rainwater pooling at his feet, warmth surrounding him, he felt something crack. Not painfully, relievingly, because he realized he was no longer returning to a place that merely sheltered him from the world. He was coming home. That word scared him. Home implies risk. Home implies attachment. Home implies something that can be taken away. He had lived long enough knowing what it cost to lose something you'd allowed yourself to need. But here was the truth he had not accounted for. Withholding need does not protect you from pain. It only protects you from joy. The children changed him in ways he never anticipated. They asked for stories about the ranch, about the land, about him. At first, he deflected. Later, he answered selectively. Eventually, he spoke more freely than he meant to. They listened like every word mattered, and maybe to them, it did. She noticed his softening before he did. The way he smiled more easily. The way he scolded less harshly. The way he lingered at the edges of their world instead of keeping himself apart. Still, she never rushed him. She had learned the hard way that people move at the speed of their own healing. There were setbacks. Days when he retreated. When something small, a laugh too loud, a question too personal made him withdraw. On those days, she didn't chase him. She didn't demand explanations. She held the line of normalcy steady, allowing him space without punishment. That restraint was its own form of kindness. And slowly, obligation turned into investment. He stopped seeing the children as responsibility and began seeing them as individuals. Their quirks, their fears, their strengths. One was cautious, one fearless, one thoughtful beyond their years. They challenged him, without meaning to become more than he had been content to be. They needed him, not desperately, not possessively, but genuinely. And need, when it comes without manipulation, awakens something ancient. The ranch reflected the change. It looked lived in now, not neglected, not chaotic, alive. Boots by the door, tools shared, laundry lines strung where none had been before, signs of care layered over signs of work. She planted a small garden without asking. He noticed, didn't object. One morning, he found her teaching the children how to tend it, how to be patient with things that grow slowly. He watched from a distance, feeling something unfamiliar settle in him. Pride, not in ownership, in participation. He had not planned for this. He had asked for help. What he received was connection. And connection, once established, rewrites the rules of survival. There were nights they sat on the porch after the children had gone to sleep. The quiet returned then, but it was different now. Not empty, not isolating, full of shared breath and unspoken understanding. Sometimes she spoke of her husband, not with bitterness, not with longing that consumed the present. Simply with honesty. He listened without trying to fix anything. She never asked about his past. That, too, was a gift, because she understood that some stories surface when they're ready, not when they're demanded. And one evening, without warning, he spoke. Just a little. Enough to let her know that silence had not always been his natural state. Enough to suggest that his guardedness was learned, not innate. She didn't interrupt, didn't probe. She let his words exist as they were. That restraint built trust more effectively than any promise could. What formed between them was not romance yet. It was deeper. Foundation. A mutual recognition of strength and survival. A shared respect for the way each had been shaped by loss without being defined by it. The children sensed it too. They began to see him not just as the man who owned the ranch, but as someone permanent, someone who stayed, someone who showed up again and again. And permanence, to a child who has lost, is everything. The ranch had become a shared project, a shared responsibility, a shared life, without ceremony, without declarations, just day after day of choosing presence over distance. He didn't wake up one morning transformed, but he woke up one morning and realized that the thought of losing this noise, this work, this quiet companionship hurt more than the thought of having never had it at all. And that was how he knew. The walls he had built were no longer keeping him safe. They were keeping him small, through meals, through work, through moments so ordinary they almost went unnoticed. Obligation had softened into belonging. Not claimed, not demanded, simply lived into. And once belonging takes root, It does not ask whether you are ready. It simply grows. There comes a moment in every life, quiet, unannounced, when the question is no longer, can I survive this? But why am I still living as if survival is the goal? For him, that moment didn't arrive with thunder or tragedy. It arrived disguised as necessity. It began with a letter. He found it folded on the kitchen table one morning, weighed down by a chipped mug. Official paper, clean edges, the kind of envelope that never brings good news to men who live by the land. He read it once, then again, slower the second time, as if pacing might change the meaning. The ranch had always walked a thin line. Weather, markets, age, it all added up eventually. He had known this day would come, just not when. Not now. Not when the place had finally begun to feel full. The decision outlined in that letter was practical, logical, sensible, even. Sell a portion of the land. Consolidate. Reduce risk. It would make things easier, quieter, smaller. It would return his life to something manageable. He folded the letter carefully and slid it into his pocket like a secret. All day, the ranch felt different beneath his feet. Not weaker, just uncertain, as if it sensed the weight of the choice pressing against him. The children noticed before anyone else. Children always do. They asked questions he didn't answer. Why was he quieter? Why did he stop and stare at the fence line longer than usual? Why did he forget something as simple as closing the gate? She noticed too. She always did. But she didn't ask right away. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat across from him at the table, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. The house was quiet, but not empty. Not anymore. He felt the words rise, hesitate, retreat. Finally, he spoke. Not dramatically, not emotionally. He told her the facts, the numbers, the options. He told her what the letter said and what it implied. He did not tell her what it cost. She listened without interruption, the way people do when they understand that the silence is doing important work. When he finished, she didn't rush to reassure him. She didn't tell him it would all work out. She asked one question. What do you want? The simplicity of it stunned him. No one had asked him that in years. Not in a way that mattered. Once had been luxuries he'd trained himself not to acknowledge. Needs were enough. Responsibilities enough. Duty enough. I don't know, he said honestly, and she nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken tension. The children sensed it and became quieter, more careful, as if the ranch itself might shatter if they moved too loudly. He hated that most of all, the way his uncertainty began to steal something from them. That was when the truth finally surfaced. He had convinced himself he was protecting them by staying detached, by keeping things undefined, temporary. He told himself that if the ranch remained his alone, the loss when it came would be easier. But that was a lie, because they had already built something together, whether he named it or not. The offer came soon after. A buyer, clean, efficient, interested in exactly the part of the land that mattered most. The stretch where the children ran, where she had planted the garden, where evenings softened into something like peace. Selling it would solve everything. It would also erase everything. He walked that boundary alone at dusk, boots tracing familiar paths. The land had shaped him. Yes, but now, others had shaped it too. Memory layered on memory. Life pressing gently but insistently against his defenses. He realized then that solitude had once been a choice. Now, it was becoming an escape. That night, the youngest asked him a question that finally undid him. Are we going to have to leave? The child's voice wasn't afraid, just honest. He opened his mouth and found that he could not lie. I don't know, he said again. The child nodded, accepting uncertainty with a grace most adults never master. Then came the question that followed naturally, innocently, devastatingly. Do you want us to stay? The room went still. He felt the weight of every year he had spent convincing himself that wanting was dangerous, that attachment was weakness, that love only sharpened the pain when it left. And here it was, standing in front of him, asking not for promises but for truth. He looked at her then. She said nothing. She had never demanded a place in his life, but she had made space for him in hers. That night, he didn't sleep, not from fear, but from clarity. He understood something then that no amount of solitude had ever taught him. Surviving is what you do when you're afraid to lose. Living is what you choose when you're willing to risk it. The next morning, he declined the offer. No speech, no explanation, just a decision. The relief was immediate and terrifying, because now there was no turning back. He sat them down that evening. All of them. The children fidgeted. She watched him closely, sensing the gravity of what was coming. I don't want you to leave, he said simply. The words felt foreign in his mouth. Exposed. Honest. I can't promise easy, he continued. I can't promise forever. But I want this what we've built to stay. Silence followed. Then the children moved first. They always did. One hugged him without asking. Another smiled like they had been holding that hope for weeks. She stayed where she was, eyes shining, breathing carefully, as if one wrong move might break the moment. Finally, she spoke. We're not looking for perfect, she said. We're looking for home. And there it was. The word he had feared. The word he had avoided. The word that, once spoken, changed everything. Claiming them did not mean erasing the past. It did not replace what had been lost. It did not rewrite grief. It expanded him. He learned that commitment is not about certainty, it is about presence. About choosing again. Every day, even when fear whispers louder than hope. The ranch became something more than land. It became a promise. There were still hard days, arguments, worry, moments when old habits clawed at him, urging retreat. But now, retreat was no longer where safety lived. Safety lived at the table, in shared work, in children who trusted that he would be there tomorrow, in a woman who walked beside him, not behind him, carrying her strength without apology. He did not lose himself by choosing them. He found himself. The solitary rancher he once was had survived, but the man who stood there now, hands steady, heart open, was finally living. And that, more than anything, was the choice that changed everything.